Hopefully everybody's food comas have dissipated by now. As Christina mentioned, my name is Tim Kawahara, and I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. We are a multidisciplinary joint research center of the business school and the law school, so it's not frequently that I'm down on this part of campus with all the smart people, but very happy to be here. I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. The first speaker is, Paul, can I go first? First speaker is Paul Ong. Pleased to say that we've had a long-standing relationship at the Ziman Center with Paul. He's one of our affiliated faculty, and we've funded some of his work, and it's been a great collaboration. Dr. Paul Ong is a PhD. He's a research professor at UCLA School of Public Affairs and director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. He has a professional degree in planning and a PhD in economics. His research focuses on the urban, spatial, structural, and inequality. He has served on advisory committees for the Census, the Environmental Justice Committee at the Southern California Air Quality Management District, and various Asian American advocacy organizations. So with that, I would like to introduce my good friend, Paul Ong.
Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Are you guys still awake? It's been a long day, but a very exciting day. I have really enjoyed this because I'm learning a lot. So let's get into my presentation. But first, I want to sort of put it in a broader context. I'm usually labeled Mr. Doom and Gloom. And that's because my research on inequality quite often points to not happy news. But so let me try to start off in a positive way. I am very happy that we reside in California because it's on the progressive edge about how are we going to address climate change and the environmental crisis. And what we're seeing coming out of California is an effort to move into a new urban development regime, one that is much more sustainable. And one of the challenges during this transition is how do we maintain and ensure equity as we move from one stage to another stage in terms of how we live, the city and the built environment within which we live. And I want to sort of address that larger issue through the lens of gentrification. I was telling my staff that I already heard much discussion about gentrification, and that's great. My punchline was going to be, since it's discussed, I have nothing more to say. I have a happy afternoon. But I think I have a few things to say. Gentrification simplification is that it is neighborhood upscaling with the unfortunate potential of displacement and dislocation of established stakeholders, particularly disadvantaged people. So that's sort of the broad definition of it. Another way you can look at gentrification, it's an amazing phenomenon that's happening. But it is also one that tells us about the struggle for place and space that we see in our cities. I want to put gentrification start off in a broader context, and the two broader contexts. One is that, as you all probably heard, this country and globally, we're facing an inequality crisis. In this country, we're reaching levels of income and wealth inequality that we haven't seen for probably a half of a century. And it is happening in the US, and here in Los Angeles is far worse. And those are just some statistics that I put up there. And one way you could think about it is looking at how the population through households are distributed. Here we have two graphs, one in 1990 and one using 2015 American Community Survey data. And what you see is several things. One is a push of the population towards the bottom end. So if you take, for example, the far left part of the x-axis, compare the proportion of households that were at the very low end in 1990 to 2015. A remarkable shift towards the bottom. And you see also a shift at the top end, at the very top end. And the middle hasn't collapsed completely yet, but certainly it is not where it used to be. Overall, if you disaggregate the numbers slightly differently, what we know is the top quintile, the top fifth, been gaining, and the bottom fourth have been losing during this last quarter century. And this is compounded by a housing crisis that we have here in Los Angeles. And here again, we just compare the distribution of housing units by monthly rent in constant dollars. And the simple summary is that the number of affordable units been decreasing, and the number of units that are very high priced been increasing fairly dramatically. And that's due in part to a deficit in construction of housing units here in Los Angeles. And the graph on the left does it by decade. The graph on the right explodes the last 3 decades in terms of the patterns of construction. And a number of factors have driven this decline in housing production. And at the root of it, at least for me, is NIMBYism. That is the drive here in Los Angeles essentially to stop new construction, not in my backyard. A matter of fact, if you look over the last quarter century, the amount of allowable construction has collapsed essentially to 0 or very near 0 because of downzoning. Downzoning is where a group of neighbors get together and say, we don't want multi-family housing here. Downzone it to single-family housing. We have in Los Angeles 2 love affairs. Okay. And clearly, I don't mean our spouses or our significant others. What we mean is we have a love affair, and somebody mentioned it, to the car. And that adds to sprawl. We also have a love affair with a romantic image that despite the fact that we're a global city, that we're a huge urbanized area, it ought to be built on a single-family house, on a parcel by itself. And so we have worked ourselves into this housing crisis. This is another graph, because there's a debate now about not only how many units are built, but where is it being built and for what sector? And so this one takes data by year of construction, and we break it up into 3, and this is for Los Angeles City. And this is part of another study we're doing on rent stabilization and its impact in terms of the rental market. And essentially, the 3 bars, the blue, the orange, the gray, the blue represents what we call units that are covered by rent stabilization. The blue ones are units that were built before 2010, but not covered by rent stabilization. And the gray bar are those most recent units built since 2010. And what is sort of remarkable here for me are several things. One is, we were surprised that newer units, non-RSO units, at the bottom end hasn't really collapsed that much. And I think it is due in part from the struggle of our friends and colleagues in the affordable housing sector. That is pushing for additional tax incentive units through negotiation in terms of variance in exchange for affordable housing. It's not where we want it to be, but it hasn't collapsed completely. And to me, it speaks to the power of intervention. I'll get back to that. Where it's remarkable is at the very top end. So you look at those 3 bars, and it's just astonishing, particularly when we look at the construction over the last few years, where it has shifted to the top end. Where one of the crises, a part of the crisis, is in the middle. For the working class, for those who are in the middle class, in terms of affordable rental units. So the move towards sustainable development, compounded by income inequality and our housing crisis, is manifested spatially. And one way of representing that is looking at this map. And it has a couple of things on there. It shows where our rail system is going. It also shows which neighborhoods been gentrifying over the last 2 decades or so. And what you see there is some rough correlation between where we're investing in rail and the stations where the stops are, and neighborhood change that we identify with gentrification. Let me skip ahead. So when we do the detailed analysis of this, is that trying to understand that pattern is not simple. But what we know is that it's not a simple causality, that there are many other changes that are occurring with transit development. That even after you even account for other factors, what we know is the probability of gentrification is higher in transit areas. And we also know that those are the areas, because they're gentrifying, there has been an adverse impact on the disadvantaged populations and on affordable housing units in those neighborhoods. And we also believe, since we as a public, through the state, been pushing the new regime, that there ought to be a social responsibility of addressing this inequality. Another way of thinking about this is from a new project that we're working on called NCI 2.0, a neighborhood change indicator. And it's similar to what I showed you in terms of the gentrification map, but we also map both neighborhoods that are upscaling as well as neighborhoods that are declining in terms of a number of indicators: income, education, investments in homes. And it's clear that you see a pattern there that's related, if you go back to the previous one, that lots of the changes are happening around the downtown areas. These only show the disadvantaged neighborhoods, so we didn't show all neighborhoods, so I'm emphasizing the disadvantaged neighborhood. But another interpretation I think is equally important in this map is it shows 2 things. That is, neighborhood change is a 2-edged sword. One is the areas that are blue are going through gentrification. And we do know, and then we still have to do the work, that it is associated with displacement. And that's bad. The areas that are towards the red are actually declining neighborhoods. These are areas that, in this transformation of the economy, of growing inequality, these are the neighborhoods that's taking the brunt of that economic transformation. And the reason it's a 2-edged sword is that if a neighborhood is improving, the older stakeholders can't take advantage of it. If we don't address the economic decline, the stakeholders who are trapped there also face economic hardships. So neighborhood change is bringing about this sort of double-edged sword in terms of what's happening in neighborhoods. Let me now okay, so that's just the lay of the land in terms of our research. And it's not necessarily a hopeless picture. I think what we need to think about is that we avoid this trap, this double-edged trap, through conscious intervention and action. And there's a number of ways you could do it, but I want to just talk about it in terms of legislation. In part because I think having the right policy context is critical, for example, in terms of assisting all those wonderful recommendations we heard earlier. That is, you're working in the neighborhood, you're working on parks, you're working on health issues and clinics and so forth. What helps that local struggle, is a policy context that's supportive. So I think we need to work at multiple levels. We need to work at the legislative policy level. We need to work on the ground. But I want to focus here on the sort of policy level via legislation. And again, what I said at the very beginning, we're fortunate here in California because we're being very innovative, both in terms of addressing the environmental crisis and climate change, but also being very conscious about how do we insert equity into that effort. And so here are 3 pieces of legislation, 2 of which have been enacted. SB 375. This is the one that link our efforts to deal with greenhouse gases through land use development. That is, how do we direct new development in a direction that minimizes travel, that gives better accessibility, that's greener. And the good thing about SB 375, it not only addressed the larger urban development issues, but it also incorporates into it the goal of ensuring equity in terms of who's going to benefit as we try to move land use patterns and urban development towards sustainability. SB 535 is even more explicit. It mandates that a fixed proportion of the revenues we get from cap and trade, I know that itself is very controversial. There are proponents and opponents to it. But given the fact that we have it, SB 535 mandates that a significant proportion of it be used to address the problems of disadvantaged communities, communities that are vulnerable to climate change. There is a current bill right now, SB 827, and you know that we as faculty members, being a member of this esteemed institution, we cannot advocate. Okay, I want to be objective about this. The good thing about SB 827 is it addresses some of the fundamental barriers to the housing market around transit areas. And mainly, one of the goals is to relax local restrictions on density. And also to provide some incentives to developers for affordable housing units in a negotiated fashion, plus provide protection to residents who are already there. So for a number of people, this touches on some of the key ways we need to think about how do we proceed. But that being said, it is a controversial piece of proposed legislation. It has a very currently, it's hotly debated, and it has a very curious political configuration. Let me just turn my page to make sure I get it right. So on one side, you have predominantly mainstream liberals. I include myself as a mainstream liberal, and academics who have said publicly, this is good because it's pushing the envelope. It's pushing the envelope in terms of dealing with the chokehold on development. It's good because it includes actually more protections for renters than that exist currently. And it's good because, you know, it is mindful of the fact that we need to think about affordable housing. So you have on one side sort of liberals, academics. We also have developers who see this as a big potential, a big win, right? And then we have on the other side an unusual configuration of local governments, because this legislation takes the power of local government to control land use away from them. And people with power tend to be reticent about giving up power. We have NIMBYism groups who don't like this. because it's not what they want to see in terms of maintaining the lifestyle they're used to. I already told you about our two love affairs. And then there's also organizations such as Sierra Club, which is sort of strange because they're fearful of the one before, the NIMBYism groups, not because they're opposed to the legislation, but because they see if you let the transit station come in, it opens the door to this legislation. So they're fearful those groups will stop future transit. So they're opposed to the legislation. And then we have a number of community-based organizations, affordable housing groups, who are opposed to this legislation because in their opinion, it hasn't gone far enough. I'm not sure how this is going to be resolved because I think we need to progress farther along these issues. But the good thing is that this legislation opens up the discourse about where we want to go. How do we want to reconfigure and reconstruct our cities? How do we do it in a way being mindful that benefits should be fairly distributed? How do we do it in a way that gives people a meaningful voice in the process and decision making? And so I understand the conflict that's coming out of the discussion of this legislation. And as most of you guys know in the political arena, you always debate about legislation. But I think it's a great debate. I think it's one, hopefully, that if we carry out in a conscious fashion, it provides a guide for us what the future would be. So that's my talk, and thank you for listening.